the pub. Let me begin with acknowledgement of country and acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land, the Cadigal people, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I think it's important to recognise, especially in the context of this topic, that we stand here today as we do because the Cadigal, amongst other Eora people, were dispossessed of their ancestral homes, and that the Australia we live in is a settler society which took over this land through many means, including ethnic cleansing and forced expropriation of the land. Israel is also a settler state, and it too has established itself by forcibly expropriating lands of the indigenous inhabitants. Our topic tonight cannot be understood without starting with this historical fact. And to help us further understand the most recent episodes of this colonial state violence, I'll first introduce Antony Loewenstein. He is the author of a number of books, beginning with the highly acclaimed, and it must be added, much maligned at the same time, My Israel Question, which I read, it must be almost 10 years ago now, the first edition. 2006. 2006, and which is now in its third edition and was published in Arabic in 2013. I guess we await the Hebrew version?
Yeah.
Since then, he has published The Blogging Revolution and most recently, Prophets of Doom, How Vulture Capitalism is Swallowing the World. I was going to describe Antony as a regular commentator in the media, but I don't think this does him justice. He contributes much more to the public debate than just being a regular commentator. He speaks on ABC 24's The Drum. He's a regular contributor to New Matilda, to the Sydney Morning Herald, and to The Guardian, where he now has a weekly column. In a very exciting move from Antony, which I read on his website in preparation for this, his last book is currently being produced as a documentary. He's raising funds to cover the cost of this through a Kickstarter campaign. I urge you to go to the website to look at the information about it, and also to read Antony's other publications on a whole range of issues. I wouldn't say Antony or Joseph are lone voices, but both are critical thinkers writing in our media and on a regular basis, and they both provide insights and the courage to offer alternative views on a range of topics, from capitalism to the Israeli government, military, and now, it's sad to say, increasingly wider societal acceptance of violence towards Palestinians. On this note, I turn to tonight's topic. Again, we are here speaking about the brutal Israeli military offensive that has left Gaza in tatters. In the past, we were able to describe the actions of Israel as a military and government policy, but as I've just alluded to, one of the turning points of the recent horrific events has been the almost universal public Israeli support for the use of the most advanced and lethal weaponry on a largely defenceless and entirely confined civilian population. I'm actually not sure what left me more disturbed and angry: the images of suffering Palestinian children, or the footage of Israeli children celebrating Palestinian suffering. Either way, violence in this region has become normalised. On one side, children traumatised by death and destruction, and on the other, children traumatised by racism and hatred. This may not be the violence that sparks international headlines, but this is the violence of the day-to-day in this part of the world, and people on both sides are its victims. It's into this morass of colonialism, violence, racism, hatred and extremism which we tread tonight. But amongst all this, we must remember people's lives are at stake. I've said more than enough and taken up more than enough time. I now hand over to our first speaker, Antony Loewenstein. Please help him in the normal warm politics of the pub.
I want to first thank Politics in the Pub for inviting me tonight. I've been speaking at these events, I must say not actually this venue, but at the venue in Central for a number of years on various issues, and it's always important that these sort of events continue, because in the current political climate, and I would have said that under Labor or Liberals for that matter, I think there's less and less actual robust public discussion, which I think partly explains the success of these kind of events, and also explains the ongoing success of things like writers' festivals, which get more and more and more audiences, even though the publishing industry, like the newspaper industry, is in a lot of crisis. So the issue tonight could not be more important and timely, and when it was suggested not that long ago, Gaza, I think, was still under attack by the Israeli Defense Force, I wanted to sort of outline a little bit, I think, what has happened in the last few months, some of the trends, I think, that have been going on in relation to Gaza, both in Israel and Palestine, but also in the diaspora, including here. And I think some signs of hope, which is difficult to see when you witness what's been going on in Gaza, but I think there are some signs of hope, particularly in various public opinion and other aspects. So all of us saw what happened to Gaza in the last few months. On the one hand, what happened was very unique, but also incredibly not surprising. Anyone who follows this issue knows that it seems as if every few years there's one of these outbreaks of violence. And there's an expression that some Israelis use. It's more of a military term, although it's pretty offensive, but some of you may have heard of it. It's called mowing the lawn. And it's an expression that's used colloquially, but I think says a lot about how many in the Israeli establishment view the so-called problem that they have with Gaza, namely that there is no perceived military solution. This is the thinking. There's no military solution. Hamas has been in power now for 7 odd years. Hamas is fairly well entrenched in Gaza. There's not much desire to overthrow Hamas, because by doing so you therefore will probably have to take over Gaza again, occupy it again, even though the occupation has continued, even though Israel did withdraw its settlements in 2005. So every few years, Israel goes into Gaza and mows the lawn. It's pretty obvious what that means. You can't solve the problem, so you go in there and cause carnage and you kill a lot of people as a supposed deterrent. And then a few years later, the grass grows again, you go back in and do it again. I mean, this is a familiar cycle. And the last major onslaught was 2008 and 9, Operation Cast Lead, which killed about 1,500 Palestinians, the vast majority of whom were civilians. There was another outbreak for about a week, about 2 years ago. And then the recent Operation Protective Shield, as Israel calls it. You sort of wonder who comes up with these titles, but anyway. And it killed roughly 2,100 Palestinians, the vast majority of whom were civilians. And the images that we all saw on television, online, wherever we catch up with our news, was so searing and was so, in some ways, unique. And the reason I say they were unique is because there's been a shift in the last few years about how we receive information about this conflict. When Israel and Palestine went to war, as has been happening now for decades, the narrative that we heard was pretty much filtered through the mainstream press. So a journalist might go into the West Bank or Gaza, he or she would report what they see, but you would pretty much just get their perspective. Namely, a report in the newspaper when you read it in the morning, an occasional news report on the TV, and that was it. Radio, of course. The internet has changed all that, and I think it's really important that we don't underestimate how profound this has changed the way this issue is viewed globally. You had during the recent war both Gazans themselves using Facebook, Twitter and other social media tools to literally up-to-date people all the time what was going on, what they were seeing, what was happening to them literally in front of them. That's one change. So rather than having to see what a journalist sees, you're able to see a Palestinian, him or herself, tweeting, writing about it with huge audiences, like massive global audiences. You also had a number of Western journalists, some of whom did some really important great work going into Gaza, either from the West Bank or Israel, who are also Facebooking and tweeting, taking photos, writing amazing reports, and also doing some wonderful television reporting as well. The images don't lie. And the reason why Israel is so concerned about its public image is that the images speak for themselves. What they say is very clear. You had mass carnage, you had complete collective punishment, which was being reported on not just a daily basis, but many times every day. And anyone who's not online, I would encourage you to do so, because if you solely rely on Fairfax or, God forbid, the Murdoch Press or the ABC, you're only getting a very, very narrow view. Some of those outlets did some good reporting. I'm not saying they didn't. Some good, some bad. But overall, some of the best reporting was not done by those outlets. It was done by various other players. Some of you had a big audience and some had a small audience. And what was very clear during the Gaza, it's not really a war, it was more of a massacre, was that with a few notable exceptions and pockets, global public opinion has turned so fast against Israeli actions as to be remarkable. Sure, you had protests in support of Israel in Sydney and Melbourne and in the US and Europe. They exist. There were pro-Israel marches, to be sure. But they were massively outnumbered by the huge public outcry of outrage and solidarity with Palestine, which you saw here, but even in greater numbers in the US, and particularly Europe and London. The numbers of protests in London are unclear, but anywhere between 50 to 100,000 people marched on more than one occasion to show solidarity with Gaza and Palestine, and denouncing the British government's wasn't just a weak response, it basically was pretty much little response apart from blind support. There was some dissent. And it's important that near the end of this current crisis, a senior cabinet minister resigned. Some of you might remember this. She was a Muslim woman who was very outraged by what was happening, and she had said that she had tried for many years, which I would believe, trying to change the position of the British government towards Palestine. Some would say it's a good luck with that, considering it's a Tory government. Nonetheless, she'd been trying to do so, and in the end felt that it was simply untenable to remain in that position. And she resigned, and it caused a huge scandal, and it forced some other people in the David Cameron's government to come out and say they also felt a bit uncomfortable. Now, speaking out is one thing, actions is something else. And the British government has said, although that would require pressure to enforce that there needs to be some kind of arms embargo placed on Israel when this kind of action is happening. We shouldn't forget one very important detail. When a government comes out and condemns a certain action, and for example the US government during the recent conflict sometimes did condemn what was going on. However, there was a classic example in the middle of the war where the US State Department on one day condemned a massacre of a UN school. There was about 15-20 Palestinians killed. The following day, the Pentagon rushed out more arms to Israel to continue its war. This is the way empire works. On the one hand, you have one arm of it that is maybe outrage, assuming you believe that was true. On the other hand, you have a major, well, one of the world's biggest arms deals essentially replenishing Israeli missiles the following day. This is a bit of a problem, self-evidently. And in Britain there was talk about trying to enforce some kind of arms embargo, and indeed Amnesty International and many others have been calling for years for this very thing. And indeed even the Greens, whose policy on Israel-Palestine needs a lot of work in my view, on this issue their policy actually is for an arms embargo. You never hear them really talking about it. Lee Rhiannon is an exception, she does mention it. But most of the Greens don't talk about this particular part of their policy, and I think that they should. So there's been a profound shift in how public opinion views this conflict. And you wouldn't notice, of course, from the Australian government, bless them, who during this whole conflict pretty much either said nothing, or they said we support Israel, or we condemn Hamas, and we condemn Palestine, and we support Israel. And by the way, we support Israel. Now that's a pretty default Australian government position. It's not particularly new. It wouldn't have been any different if you would have had Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister. It's a pretty normal, unfortunately, response. But what is shifting, although you don't often hear much about this, there has been... I'll get some water, if I may. I'm not about to cry. I'm not sure how many of you heard this, but during the war, there were a number of backbench Labor and indeed Liberal politicians who signed quite a relatively strong, I mean it wasn't that strong, but strong for parliamentarians, condemning the war, calling for its end, and talking about some kind of resolution. And that was initiated by Melissa Park, who's a Labor MP from WA, who's quite outspoken about this issue, to her credit. Her party is not so much, as we all know, but she certainly has been. She's quite active on Twitter, and she worked in Gaza a few years ago, I think with the UN or with an A group, I'm not quite sure, I forget now. She initiated a petition which was signed, I think, I'm going to say 40 politicians, I could be happy to be corrected on that. And that wasn't signed by, you know, leading major politicians on both sides, but there was a noticeable shift of growing dissent within the major political parties. I don't want to exaggerate this, because ultimately what matters is what, say, Tony Abbott or Bill Shorten say or do as leaders. That's what matters. But there is growing dissent within the major political parties. I know it because I speak to politicians about it, and people who do engage with them more often than I do, thankfully. also say there is growing disquiet within the political parties lower down rather than higher up. And that, to me, requires more pressure from the public on various on our MPs to sort of say, you need to stand up and be more vocal about this and not simply blindly accept a particular position. What's also very clear, and let's face it, after this many years, everyone knows the reality of the American presidency under Barack Obama, that if there was, and I use that term, if there was any hope that the US administration would be any different after the Bush administration, that dream is long over. It was over arguably before he won, but nonetheless, if it wasn't over before he won, it's over now. And I think the Obama administration really shows very clearly the profound limits of, and willfully limited limits of how the US wants to view this conflict. There undoubtedly are growing shifts in the US public about this issue, which I'll get to in a minute, particularly in the Jewish community. And I think it's a mistake to just presume that the US administration, whether it's Obama or Bush or whoever comes next, maybe Clinton, God help us, in a few years, is very pro-Israel just because of a lobby. A lobby is important. A lobby is powerful. A lobby influences politicians through money, cajoling, trips to Israel. All that's important, and it's vital to this issue. But it's not the only reason. In other words, if a lobby didn't exist tomorrow, the US wouldn't suddenly become massively pro-Palestine. It's more complicated than that. Having said that, there's no doubt that there are many US politicians who are utterly petrified of saying anything critical of Israel for the fact that if they don't support Israel, their opponent in the next election cycle will be funded by AIPAC or other lobby groups. This is a fact. So the US administration was very supportive of Israel. Of course, they fund them and they increased military spending, and indeed also funded Iron Dome, which is a military, I guess you could say, technology which stopped some certain Hamas missiles coming into Israel, or hitting, should I say, civilian areas. And they sent more arms during the conflict itself. So the US position was pretty clear throughout the whole time. Let's get to some nuance here. There's some interesting articles that have appeared in the last few weeks, so I don't think I've got much coverage here, that is worth mentioning to you in this context about actually what this war was about and what it actually achieved from the Israeli perspective. Not very much. There was a piece in the New York Times 2 days ago. It's a very small article. I want to read you the first paragraph. A senior Israeli military intelligence officer acknowledged on Tuesday, this week, that only several hundred Hamas operatives out of a total that he put at 16,000 were killed during this summer's 50-day war. The article then goes on, and this of course was all unsourced, so it's some mysterious anonymous Israeli official that's talking to his good friend in the New York Times. Now, there's no way to verify the accuracy of this. I'm just simply passing on what the New York Times is saying about it. It might be true, it might not be. Let's presume that it is for a minute. The Israeli intelligence says it's confirmed the death of 341 Hamas operatives. Now, the vast majority of people who were killed were not seen, even by Israel, as Hamas operatives. So what does that say to you? Obviously that the vast majority were civilians. And the argument that is constantly made is, of course, well, Hamas, as we've heard a million times, and this needs to be addressed, the reason so many civilians are dying and being killed is because Hamas bases some of its missiles in civilian areas. And having spent time in Gaza myself a few years ago, just after the 2009 war, there is some degree of truth in that. However, and it's a really important however, anyone who's been in Gaza, the whole territory is a civilian area. It's not as if it's a wide open space like the middle of Australia where you can just sort of find empty areas. Gaza is a tiny enclave. There's 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza and living in one of the most tightly concentrated places in the world. I don't for a second defend Hamas targeting civilians. I've said for a long time, and I'll say it again here, that any targeting civilians to me is inappropriate, it's wrong, it's illegal, it must be condemned. It must be condemned. And indeed, the rule that Hamas has established in Gaza, putting aside all the issues that are going on both on the Egyptian and the Israeli side, Hamas has established an incredibly brutal and repressive regime there. Let's be very clear about that. They're trying to establish a kind of almost, I would argue, a Saudi-style repressive Islamic state. This is something as liberals, progressives, humanitarians, we should publicly, in my view, oppose. None of this means, however, that Hamas is not supported by a lot of Palestinians themselves. And in fact, after this current war, there was a poll that came out this week which found, not surprisingly, over 60% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, not just Gaza but the West Bank, polled by a Ramallah-based polling company, said they'd vote for Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh if he was to run for president in any kind of election. Just 32% said they would vote for current President Mahmoud Abbas, who we should say for the record, his term expired a long time ago, as indeed has Hamas's rule in Gaza, but minor details of democracy there. A lot of Palestinians argue, and I think unfortunately there's some truth in this, that the only way any concessions will be made from Israel is after a war. This is the sad, brutal reality of this conflict, that if you engage for decades in fruitless negotiation, which the Palestinian Authority has been doing for more than 20 years, all they've achieved, as we know, are more settlements and a complicit Palestinian Authority whose role is now to manage the occupation for Israel. That's what the PA does. That's its role. And when the generation of Mahmoud Abbas and others finally drops off, and we can wish that only happens sooner rather than later, this conflict will change a lot. Because many of the younger guard, both in the PA and indeed Hamas, fundamentally see this conflict in a different way. They do not believe in being polite for 20 years to an Israeli power to achieve nothing. Nothing. And the reason the Palestinian Authority has been doing this for so long is because they're making money from it. Let's be frank about this. They are getting funded and trained and armed by Israel and the US. You have essentially almost a quisling government in Ramallah. And the reality for that is that many Palestinians who are younger, and it's a young population, do not anymore accept the idea that you should negotiate with the partner, so-called, and achieve nothing. It's a pretty reasonable response. Since my esteemed colleague hasn't arrived, I'm going to say a few more things for the next hour. No, I won't speak. Just joking. How long do I have? Well, I guess as long as... Keep on going, yeah. Okay, a few more things.
When people fall asleep.
Exactly. If I see eyes closing, I'm realising I should get off the stage. A few other points I've just written down here. We shouldn't also forget in this whole issue the role of Egypt. Now, Egypt is not talked about as much as the role of Israel. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were in power in Egypt for about a year, and I don't for a second defend their rule, they were repressive, but arguably very much less repressive than the current government now. And they were democratically elected, which is something that people often in the West who support the overthrow of the regime conveniently forget. There was definitely a warming towards Hamas. There was a small but noticeable opening of the border between Gaza and Egypt. It wasn't great, but it certainly existed. And there was a belief, I guess, because the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas are to some extent brothers, of a warming relationship, and that's radically changed, as anyone here will know. The effect of that is that when there was the war in the last month, the Egyptian border with Gaza was mostly sealed shut the entire time, and opened here and there occasionally, but it was mostly shut. And the role of Egypt here is central, because when there were negotiations for a ceasefire, they're constantly held in Cairo. So you have an Egyptian regime on the one side, an Israeli side, Palestinian side, and Hamas. The idea that Egypt is some kind of honest broker is about as much of a joke as Washington being an honest broker. And the reality is that Hamas, ironically, despite the fact that in the last war it arguably won, despite the fact that it remained standing, which is pretty much the way the Palestinians view things, like we say Hezbollah in 2006, where southern Lebanon was destroyed, frankly, but the fact that Israel could not destroy Hezbollah meant that Hezbollah could claim that they won that war. That's how, in the asymmetric war in the Middle East, that's how that works. Hamas is actually very isolated in the Middle East, ironically. Very, very isolated now. And I say that because, as anyone who follows that region will know, there's been a gradual shift in the last few years, and almost I guess you'd say almost a purge or an attempt to try to purge any kind of move towards a Muslim Brotherhood style regime. It doesn't mean, of course, that the Arab leaders aren't supporting other forms of radical Islam, and as everyone who knows what's happening with Iraq and Syria at the moment, that the rise of ISIS is directly related to funding from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Minor detail which the press doesn't talk about very much. I only mention this in the context of saying that Hamas remains very isolated in that region. Its base used to be in Damascus, in Syria. A few years ago it made the decision to leave Damascus because they felt that they were, by staying there, they were giving support to the Assad regime. The leader of Hamas is now based in Qatar. He travels a lot, but he's based in Qatar, in Doha. And Qatar, of course, has become a major player in this part of the world. Qatar obviously has the Al Jazeera TV station, Arabic and English. It funds a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood activities in the Middle East. It provides cover for Hamas, and also hosts a massive US base. So Qatar plays many games, and I guess the US is happy to accept that because that's the way the US rolls. But I think it's important that we realise how the architecture of the region on the one hand is changing, on the other hand it's actually pretty similar to how it's always been. But different players have risen, and Egypt in some ways has stayed pretty much the same, except the leadership has changed. But Qatar's role was not the same 10 years ago, and Qatar now sees itself as a major player. Let me say a few things in conclusion before my esteemed colleague may show up, or not. There's been a real change, and you don't hear this so much here in Australia, but there is a almost, I'm going to use the term civil war in the American Jewish community about this issue. There are major changes going on here, and it's mostly generational. So you have, on the one hand, an older guard, often the ones who run the Israel lobbies, often the younger members too, but mostly older men of a certain generation. Some of them have even Holocaust survivors themselves, not all, but some are. The head of the Anti-Defamation League is a Holocaust survivor. Very hard line, pro-settlement, pro-Israel, pro-war. You have a younger, and I'm generalising here, but this is the general trend of what's happening in the US. You have a younger Jewish generation, teens, 20s, 30s, and the polls are showing this in the last 5 years, who feel distinctly uncomfortable with what is going on. They're uncomfortable with what Israel is doing. They feel uncomfortable with the Jewish leadership that claims to speak in their name and support Israel uncritically. And there's this fascinating dichotomy going on where a lot of young people who live in the West say, okay, I like living in a multicultural society, whatever, and all of that means, food, culture. I want to maybe date men and women who are not Jewish. In other words, I have no problem assimilating and maybe going out, marrying, having children with those from a different background. This is something that petrifies the establishment Jewish community. Their aim is to perpetuate Judaism, and that means that if you're going to, as a man, a straight man, you have to marry a Jewish woman and have a Jewish child. That's how the thinking goes. The change is that many young American Jews simply no longer buy that line. And the effect of that so far politically has not been great. In other words, the US Congress is still in lockstep with Israel. That's true. But in the Jewish groups on campus across the US, growing support for BDS, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which I encourage you all to look at. They're a great young organisation. They've been around for about 5 or 6 years. They are actively involved on this issue. They're very, very prominent on these kind of questions, and they've actually the most well-known Jewish organisation in the US which is actively supporting these kind of questions. So
I'm sorry, it's mine.
No, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It's all good.
I can stop filming and it's stopped.
Fine.
Sorry.
Mobile phones happen. So often when we hear in the Australian press someone from a Jewish organisation, I think there's an assumption made because they say it. The Jewish community thinks this. The Jewish community says that. As a Jewish community we support Israel. And there's no doubt many Jews support Israel. That's for sure true. What they don't say is that they fear what is happening in the US and Europe is going to start happening here. And there is some evidence for that happening here. There's less polling, of course, that happens here than in the US and Europe. But there's growing evidence here that a number of young Jews are very uncomfortable with what is going on. They're more outspoken. they speak more critically, they're not a part of the established Jewish community, and therefore in future generations the Jewish community has a bit of a problem. It makes a decision to either continue blind support for Israel regardless of what it does, regardless of how deep the occupation continues, and those alliances the Jewish community is finding are pretty much based on an orthodox hardline position and evangelical Christians. Those are the alliances that you see forming increasingly in the US. So liberal Jews simply don't have that position. They don't want to be a part of that community, and sometimes they choose to be part of no community. But if they are engaged in these questions, and they do want to support boycotts against Israel, or speaking out against what's happening, or forming a more liberal, progressive view of the world, they need to make a decision, I think, in some ways about what kind of community they want to be a part of. I want to finish with one interesting point. There's been, I think, in the last, I would say for decades, but let's just say in the last few years, kind of a crisis within liberal Judaism about the idea of being a liberal Zionist. And for those who don't know what being a liberal Zionist means, I guess it means you see yourself as liberal, progressive on various issues, but you're still proud to be a Zionist, and as a Jew you want to be showing some kind of support for what Israel does. You may be uncomfortable with elements of it, the occupation, war on Gaza, etc. And many of the so-called liberals that you hear in the press in Australia and America and Europe are liberal Zionists. People who are, as I said, proud to be Jewish, but also see themselves as liberal and also Zionist. The crisis that they face is that the image that they have of Israel no longer exists. It arguably never existed. But in their mind, they have this fantasy Israel, which was a thriving democracy, trying for peace, and sure, it's been an occupation 50 years, but anyway, moving on. And, I mean, I'm generalising a more complicated argument, but that's the sad reality. They're being mugged by reality. That Israel has become, and arguably has always been, but particularly in the last 10 years, and this ties into what Noah said before, when you had polls during the recent Gaza conflict, 95% of Israelis support the war and wanted it to go on more, presumably to overthrow Hamas and presumably to then reoccupy Gaza, I have to presume. Liberal Zionists are in a crisis, and I mention them only because these are the kind of voices who are providing often the liberal cover for what Israel does. You're always going to have the hardliners on the one side who say, doesn't matter what Israel does, we support them blindly. They're going to exist, old or young. But liberal Zionists, young or old, often are the ones who are internally so angst-ridden about what's going on, but still want to support Israel. And they're being mugged by reality. For those who haven't read it, I'd encourage you to read a great book by Max Blumenthal called Goliath. He's an American journalist, Jewish journalist. He wrote a great book last year talking about Israel-Palestine, but particularly focusing on what's happened to the Israeli public in the last 10 years. Embracing, not all, but embracing a hardline fascism, massive intolerance, racism. This is not on the fringes anymore, it's very much in the mainstream, where you have key members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, who openly espouse genocidal views. This is not my opinion, it's even during the recent war, there were key senior Knesset members, and don't you find it funny that the media will report a drop of a hat, some crazy imam somewhere talking about how he hates Jews, but which should be condemned, I might add, but at the same time, you rarely, if ever, get same and similar coverage of extreme, powerful Jewish figures in the Knesset who have got influence, talking about, for example, during the war, there was one comment made that we should put all Palestinians in Gaza in concentration camps. I mean, the fact that, history sort of satire almost dies when you hear a prominent Jewish person saying that. So there was a piece published a few days ago in Haaretz, which is a sort of liberal Zionist Jewish newspaper from Israel. It has some good journalists, for sure. Also some blind spots. Hemi Shalev, who's a journalist from that newspaper, he wrote a piece about how he's becoming very conflicted, which is Jews like being angst-ridden about this issue, and frankly they need to get over it. But anyway, he wrote this: with the benefit of hindsight, it is hard to counter the argument that the perennial search for a two-state solution has served as a cover for a de facto annexation of the West Bank. Yeah, no shit. that absolves, that was my words, not his, that absolves Israel's of the need to grant the Palestinians full rights. Without the dangled promise of eventual peace, it would be much harder for Israel to look in the mirror and rebuff the claims of apartheid. He goes on to say that after the war in Gaza the last few months, Israel's image around the world is trashed. It was not very good before, it's even worse now. Anyone who makes an argument of a two-state solution, which many people still do, will look at the facts and say, how, where? It's simply not going to happen. So therefore, what happens next? And where do we go from here? Argue for one-state solution, and we can argue differences and agreements about that. Ironically, someone like him, who's almost desperate to show he has a solution to something, is supporting the idea that increasing the Israeli far-right support, which is also a one-state solution. I haven't got time to go into detail what that means, but in short, their one-state solution obviously means under Jewish Zionist control, but it means annexing the West Bank and allowing Palestinians to vote. Now, that's illegal under international law. Again, minor detail, but my point is that there are now, with the far right in Israel in the ascendancy, that is seen as a possible so-called solution, bypassing any two-state solution and saying, let's annex the whole West Bank, let's give Arabs the vote. There's still going to be differences in terms of what their rights are, let's face it, because you're still going to have a Jewish state. And what this guy writes is in some ways, well, it's not ideal, but it's better than what we're in now. In other words, there is desperation in liberal ranks, and this I think is really actually positive. So I want to end by saying, despite it being a horrible 2 months, and an awful month in Gaza where there's been so much destruction and death and carnage, the debate in many countries around the world, surging support for BDS, which I've only mentioned in passing, and a realisation, particularly in parts of Europe, of belief in that many European countries now themselves, for example, are encouraging and telling their citizens not to invest in the West Bank because it's illegal to do so. And we shouldn't forget that although this has been a shift in Europe in the last 5 or so years, anti-Semitism is there, and it's real. And I only mention that in the end because often in this debate, I'm not someone who uses anti-Semitism as a weapon to stop debate about Israel. I haven't, I'm not doing that now. What I am saying is, and I base this on not people who criticise Israel, but the fact that there is undoubtedly within elements of the pro-Palestinian community, call it whatever you want, elements of real Jewish hatred. It is there. And if we ignore that and don't condemn it, we are, I think, failing. This is a problem. And in parts of Europe in the last few months, it's on the fringe, but you see it. When you have synagogues being attacked, it may well be because of what Israel is doing. I think that's intimately connected. But nothing still justifies doing that. And we need to call that out for what it is. Thank you.